dolls, and welcome back to another video. I have been wanting to make this video for quite a while now because I feel like when we talk about 1960s fashion, there is a big difference. And that difference, of course, is evident in early 60s versus late 60s styles, but I feel like the bigger difference was between 1960s European and American fashion. And so today I kind of want to take a look at both of these places and how fashion changed and how during the early 1960s Europe was the place to be. It was the place that dictated what was on trend. But then as the 1960s progressed, especially going into the mid and late 1960s, psychedelia, hippies, all of that, the fashion focus very much shifted to the United States. It's a phenomenon that has always fascinated me, and so today I would like to present you a tale of two styles: 1960s fashion in Europe and America. The 1960s was a decade of revolution, rebellion, and reinvention, a time marked by a defiant symphony of revolution, rebellion, and a radical reinvention. Gone were the prim, structured silhouettes of the previous decade, swept away by a tidal wave of youthful energy. This was a time when the young, emboldened and hungry for change, seized the reins of style, dictating a new visual language that echoed the seismic shifts rocking society. From the pulsating cobblestone streets of London, where miniskirts and mod suits ignited a cultural firestorm, to the elegant yet increasingly experimental avenues of Paris, where designers grappled with the dawn of a new era, and down to the sun-drenched boardwalks of California, where tie-dye and free-flowing fabrics mirrored the burgeoning counterculture. Fashion became a vibrant, visceral expression of cultural upheaval, the soundtrack of a generation. The way one dressed transcended mere trends. It became a powerful declaration of identity, a visual manifesto of one's attitude, and a tangible symbol of belonging within a rapidly fracturing and reforming world. Each thread, each hemline, each bold pattern told the story of a generation determined to redefine itself. So to understand why fashion differs in different places, it is kind of important to look at the cultural and historical context of different places. At the dawn of the 1960s, Europe, and particularly Paris, stood as the epicenter of fashion, a stage set for a dramatic shift. Paris, with its time-honored reputation as the heart of haute couture, remained the bastion of elegance, where visionary designers like Yves Saint Laurent, Pierre Cardin, and André Courrèges were meticulously crafting sophisticated yet undeniably modernized silhouettes. They were subtly pushing boundaries, infusing classic designs with a hint of the future, laying the groundwork for the decade's eventual upheaval. Meanwhile, London, long associated with the state traditions of tailored and traditional menswear, was beginning to stir, a nascent revolution brewing beneath the surface. The rigid lines of Savile Row were about to be challenged by the vibrant, untamed energy of youth-driven styles that defied the established order. The post-war generation, burdened with the memories of austerity and eager to shake off the past, found its voice, and British youth in particular were at the forefront of this exhilarating change, ready to rewrite the rules of fashion. In America, fashion followed a slightly different, more hesitant trajectory. The conservative styles of the 1950s, with their emphasis on conformity and respectability, still lingered, particularly in middle-class circles, where the pristine aesthetic of Ivy League preppiness reigned supreme. Clean-cut button-down shirts, polished loafers, and impeccably tailored blazers were the uniform of the day, a symbol of stability and tradition. However, even within this seemingly unyielding landscape, cracks were beginning to appear. Coastal influences, especially from the sun-drenched shores of California, were introducing a more relaxed, casual aesthetic that prioritized comfort, freedom of movement, and an easygoing, sun-kissed lifestyle. This burgeoning countercurrent, with its emphasis on informality and individuality, hinted at the seismic shifts to come. The youth of 1960s America, raced on the rebellious rhythms of rock and roll and the captivating imagery of television, were beginning to find their voices, to question the status quo, and to assert their own unique identity. This simmering discontent and growing sense of self-awareness were setting the stage for an explosion of new styles later in the decade, a cultural metamorphosis that would redefine American fashion. I feel like a big part of 1960s fashion and the difference between American and European fashion was the overall change from haute couture to a more ready-to-wear approach to fashion. It was safe to say in the 1960s, fashion was changing for everyone, no matter where they lived. Before the 1960s, high fashion was synonymous with haute couture, luxurious, custom-made garments designed for the wealthy elite. However, as the decade unfolded, ready-to-wear clothing, for which the French came up with the beautiful term prêt-à-porter, gained momentum, signaling a shift towards more accessibility and mass production. In Paris, couture houses like Dior, Givenchy, and Balenciaga had long dictated the rules of fashion, but designers such as Yves Saint Laurent and André Courrèges disrupted the status quo by embracing ready-to-wear collections that blended high fashion with everyday practicality. André Courrèges in particular epitomized this new idea of fashion with his futuristic, minimalistic designs, which were both innovative and commercially viable. In America, the ready-to-wear industry had already been thriving, but it truly flourished in the 1960s as mass production techniques improved. Designers like Rudi Gernreich and Bonnie Cashin embraced practicality, creating garments that reflected the fast-moving lifestyles of a modern woman. Unlike the heavily structured silhouettes of the 1950s, these new designs prioritized ease of movement, with shift dresses, wrap coats, and sportswear-inspired separates dominating the market. Over the course of the decade, the line between high fashion and ready-to-wear slowly but surely faded. While couture fashion still held a lot of prestige, ready-to-wear had become the true driving force behind fashion, making designer aesthetics more widely available than ever before. Now that I kind of laid the base of what was going on, let's take a look at both of these places, starting with European fashion, which in the 1960s was largely defined by rebellion and refinement. The early 1960s in Europe were marked by a fascinating collision of established tradition and burgeoning rebellion. The teddy boys, a post-war British subculture that emerged in the late 1950s, lingered into the early days of the new decade and provided a stark contrast to the emerging mod scene. Their look heavily influenced by Edwardian fashion with sharply tailored draped jackets, narrow so-called drain pipe trousers, and skinny ties, often punctuated by loud socks and so-called brothel creeper shoes, was a defying statement. Initially an upper-class revival, it was quickly adopted by the working-class youth, becoming inextricably linked to the raw energy of rock and roll culture, a visual symbol of youth discontent. Meanwhile, the mods, arguably London's most profound contribution to 1960s fashion, were meticulously crafting a new identity. Their movement was a study in sharp tailoring, slim fits, and a fervent obsession with the sophisticated lines of Italian and French styles. Young men favored impeccably fitted suits, sleek Chelsea boots, and minimalist turtlenecks, while mod girls, with their liberated spirit, popularizing the daring miniskirt, clean-line shift dresses, and striking knee-high boots. Figures like the one and only Twiggy with her androgynous charm and pixie haircut, and of course the Beatles with their carefully curated mod aesthetic, became global icons, propelling mod fashion beyond Britain's shores and influencing designers and youth across the world. The mod aesthetic, fueled by a love of modern jazz and R&B, was a direct rejection of the older generations, a visual declaration of a new, forward-thinking era. While London was igniting the youthquake, Parisian elegance met the youthquake in a fascinating dialogue. Paris, ever the bastion of haute couture, was adapting to the changing times, refining fashion for a new, increasingly youthful generation. Yves Saint Laurent, a master of innovation, dared to challenge conventions with his iconic Mondrian dress, a masterpiece of geometric simplicity, and his groundbreaking ready-to-wear Rive Gauche collection, which democratized high fashion, making it accessible to a wider audience. Now, I just quickly want to add here that this did not go without any protest. There certainly were French women who were part of the very fortunate elite group that was able to afford brands like Christian Dior and Yves Saint Laurent even before the 1960s. And they didn't really like to see their designer fashion on younger people now. But I feel like it is very important to note that While in London, fashion was coming from the street, in Paris, it was coming from the high fashion houses, which had these new designers like André Courrèges or, for example, Yves Saint Laurent, who also drew a lot of inspiration from Great Britain and the mods in particular. Yves Saint Laurent's work highlighted the changing role of a woman, providing stylish yet practical designs that reflected the growing independence of women all over France. Designers like André Courrèges and Paco Rabanne pushed the boundaries of traditional design with their visionary space-age designs, geometric cuts, and futuristic metallic fabrics. Courrèges in particular championed the miniskirt and clean architectural lines, anticipating the coming space age. Paco Rabanne, with his use of unconventional materials like metal and plastic, created designs that were both avant-garde and strikingly modern. Paris therefore became the place where the enduring legacy of tradition met the exhilarating possibility of avant-garde futurism. Beyond these giants, and kind of for the first time ever, there were other designers and figures that were shaping the European fashion landscape. Mary Quant, for example, with her boutique bazaar on London's King's Road, is credited with popularizing the miniskirt, a symbol of female liberation. Her designs were playful, youthful, and affordable, reflecting the spirit of the swinging 60s. Models like Jean Shrimpton and Penelope Tree embodied the new, youthful ideals, moving away from the more mature, sophisticated models of the previous decade. Photographers like David Bailey and Terence Donovan captured the energy and vibrancy of the era, their images becoming iconic representations of 1960s style. And in Italy, designers like Emilio Pucci with his vibrant, swirling patterns and Valentino with his elegant, feminine designs added their own unique contribution to the decade's fashion narrative. The 1960s in Europe was a period of extraordinary creativity and change, a time when fashion became a powerful tool for self-expression and social commentary. Now let's take a look at what fashion was doing over in the United States, where the 1960s were marked by a casual, cool look and the burgeoning counterculture. While Europe was experiencing its own fashion revolution, America was navigating a complex interplay of tradition and change. Ivy League style, the American equivalent of European elegance, dominated the early 1960s, particularly on the East Coast and among the burgeoning middle class. This preppy, collegiate aesthetic, with its crisp Oxford shirts, meticulously pressed chinos, classic cardigans, and polished penny loafers, was the uniform of young professionals and students alike. It symbolized upward mobility, adherence to traditional values, and a sense of belonging to the established order. However, as the decade progressed, this image of pristine conformity was increasingly challenged by the growing tide of more experimental and countercultural styles, hinting at the societal fissures that were beginning to widen. In stark contrast, Californian cool and surf rock offered a vision of laid-back, sun-drenched freedom. On the West Coast, particularly in the vibrant surf culture of places like Malibu and Huntington Beach, the beach lifestyle dictated an entirely different approach to fashion. Men embraced the casual comfort of board shorts, vibrant Hawaiian shirts, and laid-back sneakers, embodying the effortless coolness of the surfer scene. Women adapted the carefree style of breezy sundresses, playful crop tops, and flattering high-waisted shorts, reflecting the relaxed, sun-kissed spirit of the Californian coastline. Music played a pivotal role in shaping this aesthetic, with bands like the Beach Boys becoming unofficial ambassadors for the surf style, their catchy melodies and sun-drenched harmonies providing the soundtrack to this burgeoning cultural movement. The Californian aesthetic, with its emphasis on informality and natural beauty, stood in sharp contrast to the structured elegance of Ivy League fashion, foreshadowing the growing divide between traditional and countercultural values. By the late 1960s, both American and European fashion were swept up in the transformative currents of the hippie revolution. This countercultural wave, fueled by a desire for peace, love, and social change, transcended geographical boundaries, uniting young people in shared rejection of mainstream norms. Inspired by global influences, particularly the vibrant textiles and handcrafted garments of South Asia and Africa, young people rejected the constraints of structured clothing in favor of flowing, colorful, and handcrafted garments. Tie-dye with its swirling patterns and psychedelic hues became a symbol of rebellion and individuality. Fringe, bell-bottoms, and peasant blouses with their bohemian flair dominated the look, echoing the era's spirit of peace and rebellion. The hippie aesthetic, with its emphasis on natural materials, handmade crafts, and a rejection of consumerism, represented a profound shift in values, challenging the very foundations of traditional fashion and society. This global movement, with its shared ideals and visual language, highlighted the interconnectedness of youth culture across continents, demonstrating the power of fashion as a tool for social and political expression. Now let's talk about the role of youth and consumerism, because the 1960s were very much defined by a new era of fashion buyers. One of the major reasons for the difference in European and American fashion was the way people bought clothes. The 1960s marked a seismic shift in the way fashion was consumed, and at the heart of this transformation was the rise of the teenager as a cultural force. For the first time in history, young people had disposable income and were actively shaping trends rather than merely inheriting them from their parents. Fashion houses and retailers quickly took notice, realizing that youth and not the traditional adult clientele were the new tastemakers. In Europe, this shift was most visible in London, where boutiques like Bazaar, Granny Takes a Trip, and Biba replaced traditional department stores as the go-to shopping destination for young people. These shops catered to a fast-paced, trend-driven market, offering affordable, ready-to-wear pieces that changed with the season, something unheard of in the couture-dominated fashion industry of the previous decade. Meanwhile, in Paris, designers like Yves Saint Laurent recognized the shift towards youth-centric fashion, embracing ready-to-wear collections that made high fashion more accessible. In America, mass production and consumer culture fueled an explosion of fast fashion. Department stores in cities like New York and Los Angeles stocked racks upon racks of miniskirts, bell-bottoms, and brightly colored shift dresses, making it easier than ever for teenagers to adopt the latest styles. The youthquake movement, driven by magazines like 17 and Mademoiselle, ensured that the newest trends reached the suburban homes just as quickly as they did the streets of London or the beaches of California. The idea of disposable fashion was born, a concept that still influences the fashion industry today. I feel like I always say this in all of these videos, but it is such an important part of fashion. It's the way that fashion and pop culture influences one another. So let's talk about the role of music, movies, and more. The cultural divergence of Europe and the US in the 1960s wasn't confined to fashion. It permeated music, film, and the arts, reflecting distinct social and political landscapes. In Europe, especially Britain, the British invasion dominated music, with bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones merging American blues and rock and roll with a distinct British sensibility, often laced with social commentary. European cinema, particularly the French New Wave, explored existential themes and challenged traditional narrative structures, mirroring the continent's intellectual ferment. Meanwhile, American cinema, though experiencing its own creative surge with films like The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, often grappled with the anxieties of a rapidly changing society, reflecting the nation's internal conflicts over civil rights and the Vietnam War. In the art world, European movements like op art and kinetic art emphasized abstraction as sensory experiences, while American pop art, with its embrace of mass culture and consumerism, reflected a distinctly American fascination with celebrity and commercial imagery. These differences, while not absolute, underscored the divergent cultural trajectories of the two continents, each grappling with the challenges and possibilities of a revolutionary decade. But of course, both Europe and America had their own fashion muses that very much represented and dictated what was worn in the 1960s. Fashion in the 1960s was as much about the people who wore it as it was about the designers who created these looks. Models, actresses, and musicians became global style icons, each embodying a different facet of the decade's diverse aesthetics. In London, Twiggy became the face of mod fashion, with her pixie haircut, doe-eyed makeup, and penchant for shift dresses, setting the standard for youth style. Meanwhile, Jane Birkin, with her effortlessly undone Parisian meets British aesthetic, epitomized the rise of androgynous cool. Across the channel, Brigitte Bardot continued to influence fashion with her sultry feminine style. Off-the-shoulder tops, capri pants, and voluminous hair cemented her status as a European fashion muse. In America, Edie Sedgwick, the Warhol superstar, embodied the New York's underground glamour. With her bold eye makeup, chandelier earrings, and mini dresses, she brought an edgy, avant-garde sensibility to the decade's style landscape. Meanwhile, Cher and Janis Joplin pioneered the bohemian psychedelic aesthetic, blending fringe, embroidery, and vintage influences into their signature looks. These women weren't just fashion plates. They were cultural symbols, embodying the shifting ideals of femininity, rebellion, and youth culture. Their influence extended beyond the decade, leaving behind an indelible mark on the way personal style was perceived and curated. But of course, cross-cultural influences are always a two-way street. Despite their differences, European and American fashion were in constant conversation, each borrowing from and reshaping the other's trends. British mod culture, with its sharp suits, sleek silhouettes, and rock and roll attitude, made its way to the US, influencing the American youth, eager to embrace a more rebellious and stylish edge. The tailored, high fashion sensibility of London's Carnaby Street infiltrated American wardrobes, leading to a shift away from the traditional Ivy League look towards something bolder and more daring. At the same time, American trends, particularly West Coast relaxed aesthetic, found their way across the Atlantic. The easygoing, sun-drenched styles of Californian surfers inspired European designers to incorporate more casual, free-spirited elements into their collections. French and British boutiques began offering looser, more effortless silhouettes, merging high fashion with the laid-back charm of American youth culture. The waves of California were washing its trends ashore places like Ibiza and Mallorca, which became hippie epicenters in Europe. The psychedelic explosion in San Francisco, with its swirling, mind-bending prints and thrifted, eclectic ensembles, also had a profound impact on London's fashion scene. Boutique designers like Thea Porter and Ozzy Clark embraced the vivid colors and flowing fabrics associated with the hippie movement, creating looks that fused countercultural ideals with high fashion's craftsmanship. Meanwhile, European high fashion continued to shape American department store offerings. The futuristic, mod-inspired designs of André Courrèges and Paco Rabanne found their way into European wardrobes, influencing the sleek, streamlined aesthetic of everything from evening wear to go-go boots. The result was a decade of transatlantic exchange, where styles evolved in response to both local and global influences. What began in the streets of London or the beaches of California often found its way to the other side of the ocean, adapted and reinterpreted to fit the shifting tides of culture and identity. But of course, we cannot talk about 1960s fashion without talking about the influence of art and psychedelia, because there was a moment when fashion truly became a canvas. The 1960s saw an unprecedented fusion of fashion and art, with clothing becoming a visual expression of the era's experimental spirit. From op art and pop art to swirling visuals of psychedelic counterculture profoundly shaped the decade's aesthetic. In London, designers like Mary Quant and Ozzy Clark translated the bold graphic elements of op art into wearable fashion. Geometric prints, checkerboard patterns, and color block designs became emblematic of the mod movement, mirroring the high contrast works of artists like Bridget Riley. Meanwhile, pop art's influence, most notably through Andy Warhol's iconic prints, manifested in clothing adorned with comic book imagery, bold typography, and unconventional motifs. In America, the psychedelic explosion of San Francisco had an equally profound impact on fashion. The swirling, kaleidoscope patterns of Haight-Ashbury's hippie movement were inspired by hallucinogenic experiences and the vibrant artwork of countercultural posters. Tie-dye, paisley, and embroidered folk-inspired garments became hallmarks of the psychedelic aesthetic, reflecting a desire for freedom, self-expression, and non-conformity. By the late 1960s, this artistic experimentation had infiltrated even the highest echelons of fashion. Paco Rabanne's metallic, avant-garde designs and Pierre Cardin's sculptural space-age creations pushed the boundaries of traditional fashion, proving that clothing could be as bold and revolutionary as the art that inspired it. But fashion also did another wonderful thing in the 1960s. It became a way for political and social commentary. Clothing became a true statement. The 1960s was a decade of upheaval, and fashion reflected the shifting political and social landscape. Clothing became a tool of resistance, a way to align oneself with a movement, an ideology, or a belief system. In America, the civil rights movement influenced fashion through the adoption of African-inspired prints, natural hairstyles, and dashikis as symbols of cultural pride. Meanwhile, the women's liberation movement led to a re-evaluation of traditional gender norms as more women embraced pants, miniskirts, and less restrictive silhouettes as a declaration of independence. In Europe, student protests, most notably the 1968 Paris uprisings, challenged the establishment, and fashion reflected the spirit of rebellion. This rise of unisex fashion, military-inspired jackets, and DIY aesthetics signified a break from tradition, while youth-driven countercultural movements rejected the rigid formality of the previous generations. By the end of the decade, the idea that fashion could be a form of protest was fully cemented. What one wore was no longer just a representation of taste. It was a declaration of values, a visual representation of the countercultural shifts that were reshaping the world. One thing that I always found so incredibly interesting about this was how in the early and mid-1960s, London and Paris were the epicenters of fashion, especially London. But then by the mid-1960s, the shift gradually made its way over to San Francisco and California. In the 1960s, Europe, particularly London, was the epicenter of cultural innovation, with British music and fashion setting the tone for the Western world. The British invasion, led by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who, revolutionized not only the sound of music, but also the aesthetics of youth fashion. The mods, with their sharply tailored suits, Chelsea boots, and geometric prints, dictated the look of the decade, while the rockers and later the psychedelic movement introduced flamboyant patterns, velvet and ruffled shirts. London's Carnaby Street and King's Road became the beating heart of youth-driven fashion, housing groundbreaking designers like Mary Quant, who popularized the miniskirt, and Ozzie Clark, who defined bohemian elegance. Paris, too, contributed to this fashion-forward wave, with Yves Saint Laurent pioneering ready-to-wear collections and designers like André Courrèges and Paco Rabanne embracing futuristic space-age styles that captured the imagination of a rapidly modernizing world. However, by the mid to late 1960s, the cultural tides were shifting. As the psychedelic movement gained traction, America, and especially California, became the new focal point of the counterculture. This shift was symbolized and evident by George Harrison and Patty Boyd visiting Haight-Ashbury in 1967. You can clearly see how in the early 1960s, Patty and George wore these very motte looks, but as the tides of fashion were shifting over to America and the countercultural looks and the psychedelic and hippie styles, their style was changing too, and this is what happened to a lot of people. It was just the way the world kept spinning. When traveling to Haight-Ashbury in 1967, they were drawn by the promise of a utopian hippie community. Instead, they found a scene that was already unraveling, tainted by commercialism, drug addiction, and a loss of direction. Yet their visit underscored that, at that point, America had become the new breeding ground for culture and fashion trends. The rise of denim as a fashion staple, the explosion of festival fashion at Woodstock, and the emergence of disco in New York City clubs all signaled that the creative energy, once concentrated in London, had moved across the Atlantic. The 1970s saw American trends, from bell-bottoms to glam rock, setting global standards. As Hollywood, Studio 54, and rock legends like David Bowie and the Eagles defined the decade's aesthetic. The energy of the counterculture, once imported from Europe, now originated from the streets of New York and Los Angeles, setting the stage for the next decade of self-expression. The 1960s was more than just a decade of shifting hemlines and daring silhouettes. It was a revolution woven into fabric, a time when clothing became more than mere adornment, but a language of rebellion, freedom, and self-discovery. The Transatlantic exchange between Europe and America ignited an unprecedented explosion of style, where street fashion met high fashion, where the energy of youth spilled into the ateliers of Paris, the boutiques of London, and the thrift stores of San Francisco. video. In the sharp lines of a motte suit, one could see the urgency of a generation speeding toward the future, embracing modernity with every clean-cut edge and monochrome palette. In the sun-faded denim of California's counterculture, there was a whisper of adventure, of open roads and sun-drenched afternoons, where time seemed to stretch and dissolve. And in the gilded chainmail and space-age plastics of Parisian couture, there was the dream of worlds yet to come, of a future shaped by imagination and the audacity to push beyond tradition. This was a decade where fashion refused to be stagnant, where the old rules of elegance and propriety crumbled beneath the weight of youthful defiance. Every stitch carried the pulse of change, whether in the swirling psychedelia of Haight-Ashbury, the polished rebellion of Carnaby Street, or the celestial glow of a courage mini dress under the flickering lights of a discotheque. The spirit of the 1960s lingers like a melody drifting from a transistor radio on a summer evening, a reminder that fashion is never just about fabric and thread. It is about identity, about the restless desire to break free, to belong, to create something new, and perhaps in the memory of a perfectly tailored jacket or the weightless sway of a chiffon sleeve, the echoes of that decade still dance, suspended in time, waiting to be rediscovered. So that is it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I've been wanting to make this video, as said, for a while now because I feel like it is so interesting how fashion evolved in different places. I feel like on this channel we mainly talk about London fashion, British fashion in general, and American fashion, sometimes French fashion. But what I found quite fascinating is that once you kind of know a little bit more about 1960s fashion, which you now do after watching this video, you can pretty much tell where a picture in the 1960s was taken based off what the people wore. And that is just so truly fantastic and wonderful to me because it just shows how the time was changing and fashion was changing. But fashion has always been this dialogue between places, between music, between fashion, between movies. There's always been so much going on, and that is just incredible to me. I feel like the 1960s were the decade when fashion started to become fun. Fashion started to become so much about individuality, and I truly adore that about the decade, and I think it is what makes the 1960s truly special. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments down below which of these styles is your favorites. I have the hardest time choosing. I personally love space age fashion. I dress the most in mod fashion, but I also, especially during the summertime, really love all of these wonderful hippie looks from California and Haight-Ashbury in the late 1960s. But yeah, let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!